Today's episode of the Business and Games podcast is brought to you by our very own sound engineer, Rowie AU. You can find him on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and anywhere else at Rowie_AU. Make sure you use him as we do for all of your audio engineering needs. Welcome to episode 005 of the Business in Games podcast, also known as the Big Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mayers-Smith. In this show, we'll be chatting about anything gaming and technology, tackling the big and small business topics. Today, joining me, we have James Cowan, aka JimNeso. He's been in the esports scene for 15 years, previously working in business development for retail sporting stores for 3 years, and now part of Peanut Gallery TV, WPGI, and all under the Australian Esports Media Group. Jimmy, mate, how are you today?
I'm fantastic, Chris. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good, thanks, mate. It's good to be back in the studio after a little bit of hiatus, and I'm sure you know how that feels. You know, with sometimes real life gets in the way, and travel and business, and especially with the amount of esports tournaments going on at the moment.
I don't know what you mean by real life. It's all esports life at the moment for me. So just enjoying that ride as it comes.
Esports through and through. So just touching on your role quickly with the Peanut Gallery TV and WPGI and the Australian Esports Media Group. Some people might be a little bit confused about which one's which and what you do within them. So do you think you could give the 30-second pitch and wrap that up?
Yeah, sure. It's I guess quite simple in that Peanut Gallery TV was founded by myself and PK. I think maybe a few of the listeners might be familiar with him. We started as a commentary group, mainly servicing Counter-Strike. From there, we decided that it was time to create a tournament for women in esports, named the WPGI. The acronym actually stands for Women Playing Games International, for those of you that may be curious. And of course, our, parent company is now AEMG, the Australian Esports Media Group. So we look to tie it all in under one roof. So yeah, it's been a long journey, but it's certainly one that I've enjoyed.
Yeah, it seems to be the case for basically any esports business right now. It's a long journey and one that has a lot further to go. So I just wanted to dive straight into the topics. You know, we will have some guest topics as well or guest questions for those people listening in later on when we do play this back. But I just wanted to kick it off with something fairly generic. Just talking about, how do you see in-game commentators as of today compared to 3 years ago? 3 years ago, people like me were commentating, just kind of like maybe a side business while I was running tournaments at the same time and things like that. But you've seen just a real transformation these days into, commentators suiting up and much higher professionalism and becoming influencers and streaming themselves. So, as a commentator yourself and one person that, contracts and hires commentators, how do you find the major differences?
I definitely agree with the high levels of professionalism being demanded by the industry. It's interesting that 3 years ago, even from a tournament director's perspective, commentary or the broadcast was something that was marginalized or just pushed to the side, not really given too much of a budget. But I guess nowadays there's more of a realization that that's actually where the value add for a lot of these tournaments, and it's actually a main revenue driver, the broadcast. And now in that sense, there is that higher demand on it to be the more professional product, because that is simply now the product that is being put out to the audience. So I think there's definitely been a huge turnaround in 3 short years, and even in the last year or so, that there has been a real peak in broadcast demand. So yeah, 3 years ago, I guess what we see today, what we see on Twitch, what we see on YouTube, practically didn't exist in the form that we know it. So it's definitely come a long way, and I can definitely see it going further as leagues and broadcasters try and develop more value add in around their product. And yeah, there's definitely an emphasis now on being able to build content around the league, and that's all going to be done through the broadcast, through people like myself, through other analysts, commentators, and it's going to become a lot more like your traditional sports broadcast.
I'd have to agree for sure. And, I think one of the major differences as well is the real turnout for observers. And, looking at some of the casts that, say, ESL do globally compared to the cricket, they're able to play back things that have just happened. Someone gets a 4K and while they're in the cooldown period or in their buy-up period, they're able to, go back and show that through. Could you touch on quickly how that works from kind of like an on-the-ground standpoint?
Yeah, definitely. I think there has been that realization that your observers, aka the cameramen of the entire operation, because 90% of what you see in an esports broadcast is the actual game. Those guys are really telling the story. They're really dictating what the audience sees, what level of insight they're able to actually discern from what's on the screen. So from on the ground perspective, there are multiple different factors at play. I guess the more that you want to add into the broadcast, the more manpower that you need, or alternatively, the better equipment you need. But yeah, I think definitely there has been a shift towards those 1%ers now taking up a greater percentage of the broadcast. And I think definitely in Australia, as a developing esports country, there's a shortage of people with that skill set. So maybe that's a bit of a shout out to people now who are thinking, how can I get into esports? Which avenues actually exist to me? There are definitely avenues available, because the esports market in Australia is certainly growing, and currently there aren't really enough people with those skills to fill the gaps.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. I mean, in StarCraft, we had a guy for a while called Phil Bertino, who's was well known and used to manage a bunch of teams, and got flown to a whole bunch of different tournaments internationally to observing. But it's really, I feel like, as you said, the in-game cameraman, they're really the forgotten piece in a lot of what's going on with this kind of stuff. But I wanted to. Yep, sorry.
I was going to say precisely that they're essentially what allows a lot of commentators to be able to give insight, because they spot these subtle nuances in the game. And I think without that, without a good observer anyway, a lot of key pieces of commentary and insight can be missed.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree. And expanding on that a little bit, how would you say that your job role that your job role as a function is different to someone saying traditional sports? Let's say use the AFL for example, when you've got people like Eddie Maguire who's doing commentary of the live AFL grand finals or matches. How does that differ mainly from what you're doing in the studio and also live at tournaments?
I guess in that sense, it would depend on the tournament itself. If it's something that we're running in-house at PGTV, I'm definitely wearing a lot more hats than I would in a broadcast, for example, where I'm contracted to an ESL event. I'm simply just talent. I sit down, I put the headset on, I do my thing, I walk off stage. Whereas at PGTV, I'm wearing multiple different hats. I'm checking audio levels. I'm also making sure the observing is done either by myself in-house or whatnot. There's multiple different roles per se. So I guess in terms of a traditional sports broadcast, it varies quite greatly depending on the scale in which you're actually producing the event. So I would probably liken an ESL stage event, something maybe you've seen at PAX or even in their studio, to something more of a traditional sports broadcast, whereas what we do on a smaller scale is very different. It's very niche in that sense, because we're wearing multiple different hats in a single broadcast.
Yeah, and speaking about those multiple roles, and we're talking at the start, just a little back and forward about mentioning work-life balance and saying that everything is esports right now. And this is a question that was asked by John Dudley on Facebook during a previous podcast that we're actually using for this one as well. Do you find that the high workload of your role is set by yourself, or is it demanded by the industry, or is it a bit of a 50-50 mix?
I definitely think it's a bit of 50-50. There are certainly days where your role demands it, because you've got multiple projects going on. The timelines for those run on similar projections. So you need to be across a lot of different things on the one day. You don't have that opportunity to actually set anything yourself, because you're running to other people's deadlines. Whereas I guess in that sense, we do also set it ourselves. As a commentator of Counter-Strike, I do actually enjoy doing my product research, aka playing the game or watching the other streams and watching those storylines unfold. So it is a bit of both, but I would say that compared to some other industries, it's definitely a work-life balance that can be quite enjoyable, even if the workload is high. For example, if I'm having to do research on another competition, yes, the workload might be high, but I'm actually watching a VOD or a demo or something of the like to research. So it's not that taxing per se.
And touching on that as well, this is something that we've said in many of the big podcasts before with the people that we've been chatting to. While the whole tech industry as a whole in Australia, and specifically esports that we're talking about today, is quite infant, passion does come into quite a lot of it. And how do you feel the business experience mix versus esports passion or traditional business is within esports? Do you feel that in esports there's a really good role for, say, the boss to be someone with no experience but great finance and business background, or do you think that the esports passion trumps, or does there need to be a mix of a bit of column A and a bit of column B between the staff?
I think there definitely has to be that mix if we're going to move forward as an industry, because I definitely think at the moment a lot of esports passion is driving the industry, because there isn't a lot of money there, in the sense that you're going to have people that are going to work long hours. They're going to be driven to their absolute limits for absolutely no pay. So they have to be passionate about what they do. And that's been the case for a long time. Now we're starting to see some of the business acumen come to the forefront. We're seeing, for example, investors coming and joining forces with that esports passion and providing the business know-how, the knowledge, and pushing that further. I think it definitely needs to be that mix, because otherwise you're going to, I guess, run into a few issues, because there might be patches where the money's not coming in, but the esports work still needs to be done. There's still going to need to be people with that passion to drive it, even in the times where there are no revenue streams.
Yeah, and chatting to one of my good friends the other night, we had a big meetup in Melbourne, which was just an informal kind of catch up, and chat a bit of business and crack a couple of cold on with the boys, which I know is probably your favourite saying right now, and many of us as well. And one of the guys who came along, who's a good friend of mine, does PR for startups. And, after a little bit of discussion, we kind of decided together that esports as a whole is a startup right now, specifically in Australia. You've got not a high amount of employees that are full-time, but, they're working a lot of extra hours. They're relying on some capital gains or some funding to come in, and not so much traditional sponsorship. So would you agree or be able to expand on that at all?
I definitely think there is that startup mentality in esports at the moment. A lot of people, as I said before, are working long hours for very little financial gain. And we're also starting to see a lot of different avenues open up around this too. So I would definitely agree with that sentiment, that there is that startup entrepreneurial environment in esports right now. Though that's going to be changing, because as we now see with a lot of startups, there is that outside investment coming in. There is that business acumen coming to the forefront. And whilst it's in its infant stages right now, I don't think that's always going to be the case. I think there's room for big business in esports.
Yeah, and touching on the topic we talked about previously, you identified about esports passion being paramount, and coming from an esports background in a lot of ways can trump traditional business experience. How would you, or how did you go about transforming yourself from a player into a more business role? We used to play against each other in CSGO many years ago during, CGPL Season 1 and such like that. So, how do you find the transformation from a player into a business role? And that's not something you see so much in traditional sports. You don't see a football player retire and go, I'm going to open a main level, or I'm going to own a VFL team now and run that from start to finish.
Yeah, look, I think first and foremost, we will publicly declare that we were both CGP standard.
Yes.
So I think that needs to be made note of, but we were playing at the highest level, at least in the early infant stages. But I think there is that transition more naturally in esports, because there were a lot of gaps to fill per se, whereas traditional sports is a little bit more developed in that sense. So a lot of that esports passion for me, I know still existed even beyond my playing days, and I still wanted to be involved in the industry in some way. And I saw the business side of things, particularly commentary, as just a natural progression and something that I could step into quite easily. So I think it does differ from traditional sports. Not every person has the skill set to be able to do that, but I think it does differ in some instances. For example, where lifelong sportsmen in, say, for example, your rugby leagues or your AFL, they live exclusively for their professional lives for football, whereas people in esports, they can't sustain themselves as professionals. So they're doing other things. They're studying at university. They're also wanting to seek careers beyond esports because they're constantly being told that esports isn't a career. So I think in that sense, a lot of them are searching for a way to actually turn their passion, which is esports, into a career. So I think that's where a lot of the crossover lies.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And taking a look at, switching it around and taking a look at some people who have been able to do that, it's great to see that ex-players or current kind of casual ex-professional players are able to move into those sort of roles. And that's something that I definitely agree with your statement that has never existed in esports before, and we're just starting to see now. Take Sponge, for example. After departing from Renegades, he's now able to sit as a an analyst on a lot of boards and commentating. And we've even seen in a local kind of sense Sniper do that for a little bit while he took a break, and now he's back playing again with Atletico. And in the StarCraft scene, we've seen Jared, aka Pig, has kind of transitioned from a full-time player to doing commentary, all over the world. So it's something different, and I would definitely agree with that statement. What you're saying is that there's a lot of gaps to fill in esports, but you yourself transforming from a player into a caster, you mentioned about the observer and the kind of unsung hero of a lot of these tournaments, and there's a lot of things that they'd have to do that you wouldn't necessarily think about. But coming from a caster point of thing, from a player, what are some of the key differences you think that you could point out? Because it's obvious to us maybe, but maybe not to others, that just because you're a good player and you know your strats well doesn't necessarily make you a good commentator.
Yeah, precisely. I think I will just quickly touch on the other piece there, where the unsung heroes. A lot of people in this is true for many different industries, particularly for esports, and I think there needs to be some more recognition for the guys behind the scene. A lot of people will see the diamond, but they won't necessarily see the process that goes into refining that diamond and mining it and making it that polished product it is. So a lot of those 1%ers, those unsung heroes, contribute to that. But moving to your question about transitioning from playing to commentary, there are a few differences, and not everybody can just naturally step into that role. I think in the sense, at least in my instance, I think I was lucky because there was an opportunity there to do that, and there was a real gap in the market per se when I did decide to actually step in and do some streaming. But it's not an immediate transition. A lot of people will go into these commentary roles, particularly those that are more prominent in the scene in the sense of in-game leadership. Obviously, you do see some similarities there because they're the brains behind the operation, or at least people typically see them as being the brains and the natural leaders of the team. So having them, lead discussion, having them actually get their thoughts out is quite a natural thing to expect from an ex-in-game leader. But it's not always that easy. Being able to articulate your thoughts quite quickly, particularly if you're sitting as a color commentator next to a play-by-play, you only have about 20 seconds to dissect what's happening in the round or what's about to happen and get your thoughts across. So being able to articulate something quite succinctly and quite quickly to your viewer is a skill set in itself. And it's not something that I immediately thought about when I started commentating. And I was lucky in the sense that I actually did have a few good mentors to bounce some ideas off, and develop ourselves. And I think going forward, a lot of those, mentors are going to be more readily available now because there are more commentators in the scene. There are some greater experienced heads to actually to get some insight off of. So I think for anybody that's looking to extend their career beyond playing, there are multiple different facets there that you've got to be able to do, and it's not going to suit everybody's skill set, but it's one of those things you definitely have to try if you are looking at getting into.
Yeah, and opening the door a little bit more on this kind of topic, and we could say comparing it even to traditional sports, what are your views on a colour commentator or a play-by-play commentator, as sometimes they're called, versus a real analytical commentator?
Look, I think, there are certain molds that people like to adhere to with your traditional play-by-play and your traditional colour commentator. They do work quite well. They're proven combinations. I'm not saying, they don't work or go against it, but I think I someone mentioned it on Facebook. I think it was one of the questions about myself and PK. I haven't actually commentated with PK in a little bit, but when we did commentate, we didn't really have a traditional, all right, you're the play-by-play, I'm the color commentator. We transitioned between both. And early on, we were given some advice to actually just pick our role and stick with it. Naturally, we threw that out the window and decided to just continue on and keep with our dynamic, which was very, I guess, in our sense, it was more cricket style commentary. It was a bit more laid back. It was a bit less high intensity than others, but more focused on the conversation and building storylines around that. So, look, I do agree it works in some instances, but more importantly, for those looking to actually get into commentary, you need to find a style that you're comfortable with and just stick with it. Don't try and be anybody else. Don't try and be something that's uncomfortable for you. Stick with what you've got and develop that.
Yeah, and touching on what you said before as well about, you're looking at more of a cricket style commentary laid back. Do you find that might be something that holds esports back a little bit, where most of the commentators think they have to get in, turn up their gain on their microphone to the max, start screaming at every single frag that happens, where, we've seen this transition with players recently where, you and I played, it was all about kind of yelling at people across the room, and one thing that the Australians were great at, and specifically the New Zealanders were very good at within Counter-Strike Source and CSGO, was kind of getting into the head of others. But you look at Australis play on stage now, whenever someone gets a 1v3, they kind of bump fists and move on. So do you think that that's something that should change within esports, or should just develop at esports develops, or just let it run its course with the commentators, being ultra excited versus just talking about the stats?
I think a lot of that is actually dictated by the audience, to be fair. Some combinations of commentators are favoured over others for certain styles of events. For example, your DreamHack events are a little bit more laid back now than they used to be. Well, actually, to be fair, they've always been very laid back, but there was a period there where they did try and suit it up, make it professional, and go with the flow there. But I definitely think that the audience actually dictates a lot of it. So I think there's room for both. There's room for, those old frag movie montage style yelling down the barrel of a microphone commentary excerpts. But I think as the game develops, as the audience also nowadays actually demands a higher level of in-game knowledge, our audience, particularly in Counter-Strike Go, is very educated. In that sense, they want to know what's going on. They want to know why a certain player is doing this and how the strategy actually plays out through the entire round, and what each potential player is thinking. As the game actually develops through its life cycle, I think the onus on the commentators and the expectation of the commentators to be able to get that message across and inform the audience more than they would by just watching the match is certainly there.
Yeah, interesting. And going back to just chatting more about an overall aspect of Counter-Strike and esports and business, we had a question from @Smurfy_ on Twitter, and he wanted to know, from your opinion, what time frame do you see the top 3 Australian teams being able to play CS full-time with livable wages?
That's actually a really interesting question, because I think it's either going to be fast-tracked or it's still several years away. And I think a lot of that actually hinges on the involvement of traditional sports agencies or traditional sports teams. We've seen Adelaide Crows obviously get in to Legacy, and that's been able to, obviously provide them with some infrastructure to be able to facilitate that. Whether or not the next 3 or 4 teams that do seek investment from traditional sports teams obviously go that route, that will probably be the main determining factor, whether these guys actually decide to invest in that level of, salary and infrastructure. That will dictate how quickly things will move along. If not, I think without the involvement of the AFL and without the involvement of other traditional sports teams, I'd probably still place this on about a 2 or 3 year timeline, simply because I don't think the other important aspects of infrastructure are there, namely the investment in more sponsorships, etc., but also the viewerships as well. You aren't for strictly Australian events, they just at the moment simply don't demand that much of I guess investment from some sponsors to actually reflect what you could pay some of these players to live a full-time wage, because at the end of the day there needs to be a return on investment for these businesses coming in, and if the return on investment simply isn't there, they're not going to invest that amount of money.
Yeah, exactly. And this is something that I've chatted to some people about off air before. That's been concerning with quite a few different brands and people within the industry, that it almost seems like growing viewership is an afterthought for some people at the moment. And, doing a little bit of mentoring myself and working with someone the other day, they were talking about, seeking out investment, seeking out sponsorships. And, some of the advice I gave to them was you need to have a bit of a step back and think about what your deliverables and what you can actually offer them. Like, sure, that chasing the investment from Adelaide Crows is an awesome thing, but are they going to be able to get the viewership back when you've got, an ESL Zen League tournament on at the moment peaking at 1,800 viewers, which is great for the Australian esports scene, but, you compare that to just a general Adelaide Crows versus Sydney Swans AFL game, we're still, a lot behind what they're trying to do, and we're talking about similar kinds of money for these kind of things. So yeah, I definitely agree with what you were saying, and it needs to be sustainable investment. It doesn't need to be, I want to sell my team for $1 million and walk away from the scene. We, people like you and I have been around for a long time. On my card here, I have you've been in esports for 15 years, and it's similar for me too. We really want to see the sustainable investment, because we've had plenty of companies come in before, splash a bit of cash, been promised a lot of stuff, and then gone, that hasn't worked out for me, I'm never going to esports again. And, talking about this sustainable investments and talking about advancing scenes, I wanted to take a bit of time as well to touch on the WPGI that you're involved in, and, growing the women in gaming aspect and females in technology aspect with it too. Could you give the quick 30-second pitch about what WPGI is?
Definitely. Just going back on that point before about investment, is definitely there's a sense of the cart coming before the horse in many instances. But moving on to WPGI, I would, I guess, like to introduce the, if you're not already familiar with it, as the Women Playing Games International. That's what the acronym stands for. And simply, it was an initiative from PGTV to create a platform for women to be involved in esports, whereas traditionally there were no pathways in place for them beyond obviously what was available through regular means. So this was in many ways an initiative to encourage more women to be involved, because we find, and I guess the research also and feedback reflects, that a lot of them don't get past the lower levels of the game. They get discouraged long before they get into a more professional environment. So we wanted to try and create a professional environment at a lower level for them to actually dip their toes in and get more involved in the scene early on before they were discouraged.
Yeah, that definitely rings true, I think, with, like you were saying, the research shows and just a bit of anecdotal evidence when you look at top CSGO females, internationally playing. There's not a large pool of them, while the general stats say that women do make up a large percentage of people competing in gaming. So what do you identify as the main hurdles that you'd have to overcome with running something like the WPGI?
I think the biggest hurdle was public perception in many instances, because there were a lot of comments made about us wanting to promote equality, and equality already existed within the industry. That was sort of the main argument of the naysayers per se. I think as the products developed, as things have gone on, there has been that greater general acceptance of this is a thing now, this is something that exists, it's not going away anytime soon. So a lot of that has now just, I guess, been pushed to the wayside. And I guess some of the naysayers' arguments have changed, but I think we've achieved, at least in the short term, our goal of establishing something that exists for women to get themselves into the industry.
Yeah, and expanding on that topic, it's a question from Chris from Jam Gaming on Facebook on the Oceanic Business and Esports group. He wanted to know about the current inclusions of female in esports and how the experience can be improved for them all round, and WPGI's role in improving the general female population in esports.
Yeah, I think to Chris's question, it's all about creating a safe space for them to actually, feel comfortable in contributing, feel comfortable in actually being part of the scene, and I think that is going to be very key for them moving forward. Whilst I can say that, it is a process, we're still learning. A lot of the people involved are still learning, and there's a process of refinement. I think, we're all about taking on board the feedback of the players, the community, and improving the experience there. We're not going to stand and say that we've done a perfect job. I think most people can attest to that, there has been a process of learning and refinement, and it's a cycle that's going to continue long into the future. But I think for the moment, the current inclusions of women in esports are still only a fraction of where we want them to be. We want this to essentially be down the track and an all-female product, right from the product on camera right through to the back end there, where they're actually administering the games and running things themselves. This is a process that we want to see play itself out, and we're still in the very early stages of that.
Yeah, and one of the hot topics right now to talk about in the esports scene is the lovely word of ecosystem, and even within the tech scene with AMD pushing their latest CPUs. So how do you find that the current ecosystem in female esports has changed after WPGI Season 1 has been completed and now we're looking down the barrel of Season 2? Do you find there's any major improvements or differences in the ecosystem?
Look, I think definitely would say there has been some improvements. A lot of these all-female teams that were playing in WPGI are playing in other competitions as well. So they're wanting to actually take the team that they've formed, the friendships they've formed, and play in other competitions. I think that's fantastic. That's a goal of ours actually achieved. And I would like to see that obviously continue into the future. But back to the ecosystem per se, I think, it's going to be interesting to see where it goes. I don't think we've sort of seen the full life cycle of this ecosystem play out, and I think moving forward, it's going to be on the back of where these players actually want to take this, because at the moment it's very much now community driven. We want the players to take charge. We've put in place an all-female review panel that will dictate the direction the league takes. So it's an interesting process.
Yeah, and I would say that there's been a real uptake of teams bringing on female only squads and promoting this tournament and working in it. But I'd also agree with what you're saying, is there's a while to go before the whole ecosystem can advance and be pushed forward. But it's good to see that there's some advancement, and it's good to see that the people running it are actually thinking about the goals in the long term, rather than what we were chatting about before with investors. It's really easy to get caught into the short term and get caught up with chasing that one contract or that next sign on. So how do you as WPGI kind of plan out your advancements and what you're doing next in a whole, once again, an ecosystem aspect, rather than just the game coming up next or the next season?
Definitely, we've actually put in place some plans around running 4 seasons a year. For example, we want this to be a year-on-year product that we can actually build on. There has been some movement towards some international involvement as well, getting some international women's teams involved in actually playing during the final stages, and branching this out to be more than just an Australian product. We want this to feed into a wider ecosystem. We don't want it to be just something that exists purely in Australia and is only accessible to women in Australia. We want this to be something that actually goes beyond that and feeds into something that is quite a bit bigger than just something that's in our own backyard.
And the mentality of startups that we chatted about, and things about investing and people being bought out, etc. How do you, as PGTV and WPGI, see the role of investors in the current esports space, and how do you find they differ from traditional sponsorship? Because that's a question that I've been answering a bit, but I'm really interested to see what your thoughts are on this topic.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the investment coming into esports now it's a bit of a mix. It is a bit of a mix between investment dollars, for example, venture capitals or existing businesses. But I think a lot of the investment and where the true value actually lies in partnering up with some of these businesses is using that business acumen that they do possess. So we spoke earlier about the esports market being very much an ex-players playground. A lot of the involvement traditionally has been from ex-players or esports aficionados, and now having them partner with the business heads, the business side of things, and using that experience that they possess, that acumen, and partnering to try and expand on existing revenue streams in esports is going to be the way forward. So that's how I see a lot of these sponsorships moving. A lot of these people wrongly maybe going into this thinking, they can just cash up and exit. That's probably the wrong way to look about it, because I don't think you're going to get a lot out of those particular transactions. But I think the real value for a lot of these investors and the people being invested in is leaning on that business experience.
Yeah, and chatting about that, you're going to use that word that you said before, business acumen, and the experience that we chatted about. There's a question that Brad Moore asked on Facebook at the Oceania Esports and Gaming Business Facebook group. It's a long one to get out, but he wanted to know. And this is how I perceive the question: is he wanted to know about the transition from the owners being the face of the business to you transitioning to a business where you're releasing press releases and statements as a company. Do you find that it's a struggle for passionate employees and owners to move into that aspect and to not be so much just tweeting out your feelings and your thoughts and making Facebook statuses and such, and going the more professional route of distributing a press release and statement? And do you think that's a sign of the new esports business to come?
I very much think that's a sign of new esports business, or just business practice in general, starting to creep into esports matters. It is, like, as someone that used to be quite vocal on Twitter, I think most of people who would know of my history would know that I do like to say did like to say some controversial things. I did like to push the envelope a little bit in some of the thoughts and views and opinions that I had of how things are run. It is difficult to step away from that and actually, sit behind this new business professionalism that is coming into esports. It is difficult to step away from that, but I think it's a process of professionalizing the industry. So I think it's a welcome change in that regard. And obviously, from a PGTV perspective, it is my baby, and I guess in some instances it's difficult to have a statement come out that isn't something that you're directly projecting to the community, rather your business is. So yeah, it's going to be a process, but I think the way forward is going to be through these sorts of statements. It is going to be a better way of actually addressing the points at hand, rather than just a simple tweet or a vlog.
Yeah, so moving away from WPGI and the Peanut Gallery, etc., who would you personally identify as both a team and then also a tournament to be a mover and shaker in the industry and someone to watch who's upcoming? Because you've made it clear that you do a lot of research on your scene, and you like to keep eyes on what other people are doing to gather ideas for yourself and also push yourself forwards. Who are some of the lesser known people that you like to keep a close eye on?
In terms of teams, I guess I largely speak from a Counter-Strike perspective, but have had some involvement with Rocket League previously. I'm glad to see that Rocket League actually has found its feet in Australia and will be taken forward. That being said, though, in terms of tournaments, I'll touch on that first. I think Throwdown actually is going to be one to watch. Now, if you're not familiar with them, obviously they last season didn't run a full-scale CSGO tournament per se. They actually ran what they called a Pro-Am format, which was using the FACER platform the top players from that would be selected to then play in a pug team with some top level players from Immunity or Legacy or Chiefs, whoever they were using for that particular season, and or Tainted Minds as well, and integrating the amateur players into a professional environment and giving them an experience. I think that was a fantastic way of I guess making some of these professionals more accessible to the community. Moving forward, I think their particular format with Counter-Strike is going to more of a team-based style, but with what they're doing, I think they're going to be turning some heads, because whilst they might not be as as glitzy or as glamorous as the ESL tournament, which I still hold as the premier tournaments in Australia, I think what they're doing is building a solid base of fans who can engage with the product. Whereas ESL, the tournaments are there, but I don't think the same sort of fandom at the moment exists with ESL. That being said, though, I think IEM went a long way towards changing that. In terms of teams, from a Counter-Strike perspective, I would definitely say that the Chiefs have, I guess, stuck to the format. They've stuck to the plan. They've kept themselves as a core four over the period of time. Obviously, as an organisation too, they are very successful with multiple different games at the top of each respective sport. So for me, they're the ones to keep watching if you weren't already watching them. But I mean, other than that, I do see organisations actually coming from within the female scene. Ravens, they're probably one to watch as well, because I think those girls are very switched on. They are very mindful of engaging their fan base, engaging with more than just the sponsors. So they're an organisation to watch out for in the future.
Yeah, and you did mention Rocket League, and that's one thing that coming near the end of the podcast I wanted to touch on a little bit, because both of us coming from a Counter-Strike background, mostly that's where our passion lies, but you can't ignore Rocket League, and its advancement has been absolutely, well, like a rocket, funnily enough. It's grown so fast, so quickly. How do you find the top-level competitive scene of Rocket League versus CSGO? Does it have any major advantages over it or disadvantages?
I think Rocket League as a game actually has a major advantage over Counter-Strike. Reason being purely from a new spectator point of view. You don't need to be as educated with the meta or be in tune with how the game is actually played, because as a viewer, you can walk past, you can see the screen, you see that there's flying cars with rockets strapped to the back of them playing soccer. It's a familiar sport for many people. They understand the concept, and immediately from the get-go, people will have an affinity with it. So I think almost from the offset, they have a distinct advantage. I think what Rocket League do really well in that sense too is actually tying a lot of their sponsor messages quite well with their top level product, the RLCS. So I think, for example, they've got obviously sponsorships with, I think it's Mobile as one for an example. That's it really talks to the product. Whereas I think they've also got Old Spice as well. They've got some quite funny advertising going in and around that. So yeah, I think Rocket League as a sport, as an esport, whilst at the moment I think in terms of tiers it sits at about tier 3, it's starting to push the boundaries. The RLCS, the top level tournament, peaked at around 200,000 concurrent viewers. So if you compare that to CS, it's still a while off, but CS 3 years ago was experiencing the same level of viewership, and I think Rocket League definitely has a lot of playability to it. So it'll get there. It'll be a few years off yet, but it'll get there.
And for someone looking to enter almost any facet of esports, say owning a team, being a professional player, working in the industry, what would you identify as some of the major roadblocks that people have to overcome before they're able to take on these kind of roles?
Look, I think almost from the get-go, people are going to be expected to do a lot of work. As we said, esports is 24/7. It never sleeps. I guess business is the same in that regard. But being prepared to do a lot of work for very little monetary return is something that you're obviously familiar with, and I am too. But for someone getting into it at the moment, there isn't a lot of money going around. So the willingness to be able to actually put in that work and not expect immediate return is very essential, because there is a lot of hype in the media right now, mainstream media, that esports is booming, there's cash flowing everywhere. That's not the case here in Australia, at least. So it is a bit of a longer grind in that regard. You're not going to see immediate returns per se, but I think that's probably the strongest piece of advice that I can give to people, is to be prepared for working for some longer term gain rather than some short terms.
And what you talked about with the media talking about, cash splashing around, and we've seen like the 60 Minutes article recently, which really tried to focus on money, and we've seen some others internationally with different publications. How I'd explain esports and money and who's getting it is very similar to how I described YouTubers in some of my interviews, was that there's a great divide, to use a common term, in that you've got some of the people right at the top, say someone like Fnatic, who owns their own peripheral brand. You've got very small amount of people in the middle, who are kind of just scraping by, and then you've got an umpteenth amount of people right at the bottom who are fighting for $200 a month sponsorship contracts and things like that. And that's the way that I identify it. And right now in Australia, I think all of us are sitting around the middle and none of us are at the top yet, which is, like you were saying specifically, that's a thing to see in Australia. But how many years do you think, or maybe even more so, because guessing time isn't ever fun, what do you think the major changes are going to need to be within the whole esports ecosystem in Australia to see people like the Chiefs and Avant, etc., having their own 2-story offices and 20 employees and large sponsorship contracts?
I think it's not going to be something that happens overnight. As we said, it's going to be multiple different factors all coming to fruition. So, for example, we talked about the viewership being something that steadily is built over time, and is something that is introduced to even mainstream media, but not with this level of fanfare that some people are hyping it up to be. Something that's gradual, something that people understand and become accepting of. I think also too, people will need to be patient in that sense, not also try and burn some of these sponsors for large amounts of cash early on. That's going to turn them off esports for a long time, and you're going to just prolong the process because bridges are going to be burnt instead of gradually built and worked on over time. It's difficult to say what exactly is going to need to happen. I think a lot of it relies on infrastructure. And I mean, infrastructure is a pretty broad general term in that sense. I know you could directly relate it straight back to the internet infrastructure here in Australia. It is pretty poor from that particular standpoint. A lot of the esports scenes at the moment are still quite localized. For example, Sydney seems to be the hub of esports at the moment, just because infrastructure doesn't really exist on a national scale just yet. So there's multiple factors at play in terms of that regard. But yeah, I think it's going to take a lot of people working together to get this off the ground, because you probably be familiar with this. A lot of people are wanting to take a bigger slice of a smaller pie, rather than be content with taking a smaller slice of a pie that is grown to quite a sizable sum. So it's very much going to be on the backs of good mentalities, working together in business, and a mutual trust in that regard.
Yeah, and I really wanted to resonate those 2 points that you were saying is, point number one was trying not to burn sponsors for large amounts of cash and, over promising, under delivering. And this is something that I chatted to one of my mentees exactly about the other day, and, waiting for the right time to start getting sponsors and not doing the old, I'm affiliated on Twitch, I'm suddenly, going to contact all of these sponsors, because the lasting impressions are a thing. And if you start contacting people when you haven't got a solid business to push forward to them, we're all human beings, and in the future we're likely to remember you as that if you come and contact us. And the other one that you mentioned too about growing the pie. So one thing that is imperative in business is entering gaps in the market, and that's something that you've said that you and some of your other business partners have done quite a few times. How do you go about identifying these gaps in the market? What kind of research do you do, and how do you know when to pull the trigger, per se?
I think we've been quite lucky in that regard, that we were actually involved in the industry for quite some time and saw the gaps from the inside. So in terms of the initial movements from a PGTV and commentary and broadcasting perspective, we were in the right place at the right time. We had the drive and also the resources to actually go out and achieve something. So that particular gap was a lot easier than others in terms of traditionally having to identify and research something before you actually put a product out. From a WPGI perspective, we've also been fortunate enough to have for a long time quite a few good female role models and friends within the industry. So I think acting on some of their advice and working with them over a long period of time, we recognise that this is something that hasn't been given a lot of thought for a WPGI perspective. There's something that there is value in actually creating a product like this, even from obviously an opportunity perspective, a marketing perspective. There's plenty to be looked at in that particular regard. But we I guess in that sense we've just been able to actually, as a result of being involved in the industry, able to tailor something to an industry that we've been involved in for quite some time.
And wrapping this up, how can people watch your work and follow what you do across all of these different mediums?
I think we're probably most active on Twitter still. It's probably the most fun form of interaction going around in terms of esports. So getting people to try and articulate themselves in 140 characters or less is always entertaining. But you can find me on Twitter at DeepGimpact. Yes, that is a pun. Or you can tune into some of the broadcasts that we do at twitch.tv/PGTV. Alternatively, I don't really use Facebook, but that's a bit more of a personal medium these days.
And before we wrap this one up, is there anything else that you'd like to mention to the audience, or anyone you'd like to give a shout out to?
Yeah, look, I'd definitely like to, I guess, reiterate to our audience that esports is not going away anytime soon. It's not going to be something that just happens overnight either. It's going to take a long period of time of people working together consistently and trustfully in the same space. We don't need to step on each other's toes too early on in the picture, because we're going to be around for a long time to come. But I guess people need to be very mindful of the relationships that they build now and into the future. But in terms of the shout outs, I guess, the other guys at PGTV, love the work that some of you guys do behind the scenes. Obviously, it's the diamond that everybody sees, but nobody really sees the coal mine or the miners behind the process. So big shout out to those guys. They know who they are. And obviously, esports isn't esports without the viewer base or the fans, the people out there also creating content, giving us something to talk about, storylines to actually try and deliver to people. You're all part of an ecosystem that is not complete just yet, but thanks to your hard work is starting to flesh itself out.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us, Jim. And thank you to the listeners for joining in on episode 005 of the Business and Games podcast. Who would you like us to chat to in the future? You can contact us at Business and Games on Twitter and also facebook.com/Business and Games. If you'd like to chat about anything you heard today or anything else to do with esports, you can join us on the Oceania Esports and Gaming Business group on Facebook. You can also follow Jim at DeepGimpact on Twitter, pun intended, and you can also follow me on Twitter at SmithyMayo or on facebook.com/SmithyMayo. Once again, listeners, thanks for joining us in again for episode 005. 006 will be coming up in about a week's time, but bye for now and happy fragging.